And that's,
Do you want me to pull out a couple?
so what is that? Is that a pedomorph?
So this is a pedomorph. This is a sort of medium-sized pedomorph. You can tell it's a pedomorph because a larva that's only a year old or less than a year old would never ever be this big. It's just not really, it's not really possible for them to grow that fast. Maybe in captivity if you fed them a ton every day. But basically looking at them, the other thing is that if you look at this animal, it has a really distinctive color pattern. It's got this fat body and these very long gills. And that's just something that you wouldn't see in a first-year larva. So if they're in this form, this like aquatic adult form, only the non-native or hybrid tiger salamanders can take on this form. The native tiger salamanders always metamorphose, so they spend a few months in the pond, but then they go through this transformation. They become terrestrial animals and they crawl out onto land. The natives always do that, probably because historically their habitat's always dried up. So one of the reasons that these animals are probably doing better now is because we have many more ponds that hold water through the summer, just because of general landscape changes. And so these guys are doing better in it because they can actually stay and they avoid a lot of the hazards of the upland environment. But they're quite variable, so that's one. Some of the others in here have different color patterns. This is a huge one. So that's even fatter, even bigger. They've got these huge tail fins. This one is a female, looks like. She's really fat. And this is very, very late in the season for them to still be laying eggs, so probably she's just big and fat. She's probably been eating other tiger salamanders in the ponds as well as everything else, the tadpoles and other aquatic invertebrates that live in the pond. But they're really, the ones in this pond especially are quite variable in their color patterns, their size. There's another one. Let's see if we can dig up. This guy is an animal that's in between. So he was a pedomorph at some point. You can still see these little gill stubs. But he's gotten some sort of cue that's telling him to get out of the pond. And so he's starting to metamorphose. So the pedomorphs can stay in the pond for a few years or maybe their whole life, but in a lot of cases if the pond dries out, they can still metamorphose, and that's what this one's doing. And like a year like this one where it's really dry and this pond's lower than it's been for years, probably a lot of them are getting that cue that it might dry out over the summer, and so they're trying to get out ahead of that. So he still has these little gill stubs, but this is essentially a terrestrial animal. He's breathing air on land, and if he needed to, he could just crawl up into a burrow right now.
If you did nothing to this pond, what would happen?
Well, it's hard to say. Probably what would happen, inevitably what would happen is that eventually the pedomorphs or the non-native genes would spread up into the rest of the native population. That's what's been happening across the range. So originally the non-natives were introduced into a couple ponds. They've spread through about 20% of the range now. So we would expect that some of the animals will metamorphose and they'll move, and they can move long distances. They can move a couple kilometers at least. And so eventually they'd start to colonize more ponds and then spread from there.
And so from what I understand, that's their advantage, that they can crawl across land.
So all the tiger salamanders go across land. In fact, the natives obligately have to do that. They have to metamorphose and go out into their squirrel or mammal burrows and stay up in the landscape. These guys, some of them will stay in the ponds. So you would think maybe that by staying in the pond they'd be less likely to move, but actually because they get much bigger, they can have much larger clutch sizes, so more offspring. Some proportion of those offspring are going to head out into the landscape and will eventually start recolonizing other ponds. So the advantage is really an immediate sort of reproductive advantage, but it can spread across the landscape as well quite quickly. So the whole reason we're doing this project is to try to limit that spread by limiting the number of hybrid offspring that are coming out of the pond. But ultimately we'll have to do a bunch of other steps if we really want to control the population, because there are inevitably a bunch of hybrid larvae that are out in the landscape. So what we'll probably do is in the next breeding season maybe set up a drift fence, for example, where we're catching animals as they come in and identifying them as hybrid or native, and then removing those hybrids as well. to do it well, it would have to be a multi-year project, like probably on the order of 5 or 6 years minimum for it to really be effective. But doing something like this can at least limit the rate of spread. So it's a first step.
Okay. So it's a good thing you're here.
I hope so. Yeah.
I mean,
these things they're complex.
They would take over if you didn't, right?
Well, they'll spread, certainly. Yeah, and it's, there are a lot of different kind of scientific and philosophical approaches to it. So, for example, the reason that they're spreading is because they have some sort of advantage in competition with the natives. So some people would say, well, I'd rather have a salamander on the landscape than no salamander. Maybe I'd rather have one that's more robust. On the other hand, if you care a lot about native diversity and trying to protect these native communities, these animals are kind of different than the native tiger salamanders. They are maybe more robust, but they might have larger effects on other kinds of community members, like the other amphibians in the region. And then, they're a different animal.
Okay.
So
what's your strategy for today, like in capturing the pedophile?
Pedomorphs.
I keep saying pedophile. Pedomorphs.
Different thing.
You're not doing pedophiles there. Okay.
The strategy is just to take them out. I'm going to take them back to UC Davis, to our lab. I'll keep a bunch of them we have a salamander colony there that we do experiments with. We don't actually experiment on the adults themselves, but we breed them and look at things like the survival at different egg stages, survival at different larval stages, and just sort of look at these things that are related to their kind of strength or fitness is the terminology of it.
Okay.
And compare that to native. So some of these will go into our experimental colony.
All right.
Some of the others, unfortunately, we'll probably have to euthanize.
All right. As in terms of this pond, this location, could you explain the obvious to me, just so for a good voiceover, like with the netting and?
Oh, okay, yeah. Sure. Yeah. So what we're doing is we're actually taking these large nets, which are called seines, and we drag them across the pond. We've been doing that for probably an hour and a half now. We just keep going back and forth trying to catch the animals. So we drag the net across the pond, lift it up, see what's in it. The animals get hung up in the net because it sort of bows out as you walk through the water, and they swim into it and get stuck, and so then you lift it up. And then we remove them. We've been putting them in this bucket as we go. And then, you start getting fewer and fewer of the pedomorphs as we go along. Eventually we'll get to some point where it's, diminishing returns. We're not catching, if we don't catch any for half an hour or 45 minutes, then we'll assume that we've gotten most of them. But we'll probably, I'll be back here in another month, and on my own I'll probably seine it up a bunch just to see if we catch any stragglers.
Back for more. Cool.
That's right.
Thanks.
Sure.